Hi everyone, so we had the patch 1.1.1 patch notes coming up earlier, and I already made a little summary video about that, but here I want to dive deeper into the Nightmare Dungeon changes. In particular, the monster density changes and the boss changes, because I think they're going to be quite impactful, much more than most people might realize. So what you need to know is that, well, the density has been massively buffed, you can see this here. So this is the before and this is the after. So you see here there is actually quite a lot more monsters in there. Apparently some people counted all those red dots. This is from a Nostrava Deepwood. And apparently it's like around 50 to 60% more. That is a pretty massive amount. Now that number is not actually reflected in the patch notes. And I think that a reason for that might be that the adjustments are actually different based on the dungeon and based on the exact environment that you're in. I don't think that they're actually buffing all dungeons equally because, well, dungeons are actually not all created equal right now. So for example, if you go on the maxwell tier list here, we have these tier lists for the Nightmare Dungeons, and we rank them, for example, for solo XP farming and for glyph leveling and stuff like that. And, well, there are some pretty major differences between some of those dungeons in their effectiveness. I could definitely imagine that they actually take some of those more low tier dungeons and actually buff them more than the others. And they also mentioned that there are certain technical limitations that might actually prevent them from over buffing this even more, with like the game not running smoothly, for example, on certain devices or certain consoles and stuff like that. So at some point, I guess, the game engine might just kind of break down if you overdo it. So this might be another reason for this. So I expect that we're gonna see something like around 40, 50, 60% more monsters overall across all of the dungeons, but it may be a bit different depending on the situation. There are also those cases, for example, you might remember Mercy's Reach. If you run that, there are these two large rooms full of elites. I don't really expect that we're gonna see like, an extra 5 elites in that room, for example. And when you take a look at these red dots here, you're gonna see that only the normal monsters have increased in number and not so much the elites. So I think that generally the elite density is probably going to stay similar and we're just going to see like more regular monsters. And well, those regular monsters are actually still pretty important. Now elites have a much higher chance to drop items, so if you're farming, you're probably not going to see that many more items because I think most of them at least come from elites for now, and if elite density is not improved, then you're not going to see much more loot, which in my opinion is not really a bad thing. Like you're already easily filling up your entire inventory with just yellow items if you do like a full run, at least on the longer dungeons. That is definitely no big deal, and I think there's actually almost too much loot dropping. So if you pick up everything, you're just gonna end up with like a full inventory very often. And now we're gonna have more density, meaning more loot. And we don't have loot filters in the game yet, I guess. So we'll see how that will go. But you probably have to kind of like keep an eye out for the right stuff to pick up a little bit more than before. What it also means is that this will generally improve builds that already clear AoE very well, and it will kind of be a negative for single target heavy builds. Because, well, if you can clear the entire screen in one click like a pulverized druid, then it doesn't really matter if there's more dots or not. You just get like free extra monsters, free extra XP, free extra loot. And there are even some skills or certain builds that actually scale much more crazy than other builds because of that density. So it may not just be that you need the same number of attacks to clear the screen, but you may actually deal more damage because there are more monsters. Talking about, for example, Shadow Imbuement, more monsters, more explosions. Or maybe just like the lucky hit triggers on a lot of builds. So something like Earth and Might on a druid. If there's more targets, it's way easier to trigger such effects. And likewise, builds that are much more single target oriented, that have trouble actually clearing those large packs, let's say Rapid Fire or Barrage, they will definitely suffer a little bit in that meta. So there's also something to consider here. But there are also those boss life changes. And we have that here, so you can see that below level 60 everything is unchanged, and then from 60 to 80 bosses will have up to 50% more life, and then at level 100 is 100%. And then it goes all the way to plus 150% extra life. I have basically tier 100. And well, that is a lot of extra life. And that brings us back to this AoE versus single target discussion. So the single target builds, or the small AoE type builds that actually have high damage output, but not so much against many targets, kind of profit from this now again. How exactly it plays out remains to be seen. I think that in general the AoE builds will have an advantage in this patch compared to the single target builds, simply because, well, if the boss fight is a little bit longer, it may not really matter all that much, but your clear time in the run overall might just be significantly longer for those low AoE builds. And then it comes also the fact that, well, not every single dungeon has a boss basically, right? So, for example, just looking at the S tier here, we have only one dungeon that actually has a real boss fight, which is Zara's Lair, and that is the Spider, which generally has kind of low HP. But Udo's Cave has no boss, Deadman's Stretch has no boss, and Mercy's Reach has like these 3 guys at the end, but they're also not really bosses. Nostra Depot doesn't have one. There's a bunch that actually do have bosses here, but you can see that you could actually dodge those dungeons that have bosses if you are trying a little bit. So I think this is actually a viable strategy now, only doing dungeons that have no boss and having some really crazy AoE focused speed farming build that just rushes through, blasts down those big packs and gets tons of XP that way. The bosses themselves actually don't really give a lot of XP. They did buff them a little bit by giving them like a guaranteed like a legendary drop, so you see this here, but honestly this is not really anywhere close to it being enough basically to entice me to play, you know, a build that can actually kill bosses fast, so to say. And some builds just can't do that. Some builds just don't really have single target damage. I just now finished playing my Frozen Orb Sorceress, and the only reason why I didn't uninstall was because I put ice shards in there so I can kill the boss with ice shards and clear everything else with Frozen Orb. And already that was not too comfortable, to be honest. And now a lot of builds will actually really struggle with those bosses, I believe, especially on the higher tiers, and you're gonna notice this. And the thing is that in the game right now, we don't actually have so many tools available to like kind of push a build in one or the other direction in terms of AoE or single target damage. Of course, you can always make some adjustments. You can choose certain glyphs that work more unconditionally instead of against crowd-controlled enemies, for example, because you can't crowd-control a boss. So if you have an unconditional damage glyph, that will help you against single target bosses. Or you have maybe some other like passive choices that help you out. Or on the rogue, you have the poison imbuement. That's a very popular choice among many builds. And that will be an even more popular choice now going forward with bosses having so much more HP. I think you're going to see a lot of builds just incorporating poison imbuement, for example. But not every class has that luxury. If you play an Upheaval Barb, well, Upheaval just got a slight buff with extra berserking uptime against bosses, but that doesn't really cut it against these kind of, HP values. So I think that especially builds that are kind of weak already, and especially players that may not really 100% min-max their characters, that may not 100% understand how to actually get the most out of their characters, they will really have a bad time here. So in my opinion, these HP values seem very extreme for what we currently have in the game. Like a lot of builds, even some classes, kind of like just sorcerers on its own. If you don't stagger the boss and then defeat it with Blizzard plus Ice Spikes, for example, or you just have Ice Shards as like a single target ability, almost all other skills there are mostly AoE focused. Fireball, Frozen Orb, even Firewall, and these kind of things. Like most of these skills are actually very AoE focused and not so much single target focused. And I gotta say that most of the time the boss fights are already, let's say, not too exciting. So bosses are just not really dangerous. Bosses are mostly just there to, be a punching bag basically. And now they're even more of that. They're just like longer fights now that are not really too exciting in most cases. And I don't know if it's just me, but I also asked my chat earlier, like, what do they feel about this change? Like, what do you think with the extra HP? Do you actually like have trouble against bosses in the sense of danger? Is it actually difficult to defeat bosses? And the answer was overwhelmingly no. So I think a much better change would have been to actually just buff the damage and maybe even the speed of bosses. I think something like, for example, giving like plus 50% damage and plus 20% speed to bosses in Nightmare difficulty, and then maybe plus 100% damage and plus 30% speed to bosses in Torment, would have been already a really good change. Some builds will just go in and basically one or two shot those bosses anyway, let's say like a Death Blow, Walking Arsenal, Kratos Barb or something, And then it's okay, you know, if you have these kind of like really high burst skills and you get a nice crit, then sure, why not? But there are a lot of builds that do struggle with single target damage, and there are simply no tools available to really solve that, besides kind of pushing, you know, a little bit more in one direction or the other direction. But you don't really have, like, for example, Banish's Stricken that kind of solved this issue back in Diablo 3. Now, I'm not saying I want Banish's Stricken again. I think that was a really terrible design, you know, of boss fights in general. But the point stands that we just don't really have anything that we can put into many builds. Now, of course, this may be projecting a little bit too much. We have to wait and see how it feels. Maybe it's just going to be all fine and okay, the boss fights are just generally a bit longer and everyone is kind of okay with it. Or maybe it's going to be more incentivized to try to solve single target a better way. But I think having like such a huge difference between bosses and, for example, elite fights will make it quite naturally so that elites will always be not a problem at all. And elites are kind of the only interesting mechanic, the only interesting enemies that you do fight inside a dungeon. But if you actually have to include so much single target damage to not have a bad time on the boss, then you're basically going to destroy every single elite in like a second or two, naturally, because we're just going to be pushed in that direction by the game design. Another problem that I see with this change is also that recently we got this update with experience bonuses being much lower now when you fight high level monsters. So you get plus 1.5% bonus XP, plus a little bit of extra bonus from the base experience going up per monster level. The experience per higher level is very minimal now compared to previously before Season 1, where you always wanted to farm monsters exactly 3 levels above you because you got plus 25% XP. Now you have to farm up to 10 levels above you to get 15% bonus XP. So that is a major difference in difficulty. And, well, most of the time it's not too crazy to actually do that, but then comes the boss. And, well, a lot of mechanics break down. A lot of builds have something like Control Glyph with extra damage against crowd-controlled enemies, or they rely on some other like crowd control effects to deal more damage, and you can't apply them to the bosses. And this means that it may not be really worth it to go to higher difficulties simply because your boss fights slow down so much. This is like really the one thing I noticed whenever I was going for higher levels on a build that was not like completely busted. The boss fights do become significantly longer because of this lower damage output. Everything else was usually kind of fine, you know, elites just, you know, maybe taking another second or something, that is okay. But then comes the boss, and there you really notice the impact of those higher levels. And now even more so, because on top of the higher level scaling, they also have more and more HP bonus compared to before. So it's going to be like kind of like a double nerf going into higher tiers and trying to defeat those bosses quickly. So that will easily lead us to the point where basically no build really wants to farm levels or monsters above their own level, basically. And I think this should not really be so disincentivized. I think that's already a problem for almost every single build. And now we have even less of a reason to go to higher levels and try to find more difficult monsters. And you always want to farm monsters exactly of your own level, pretty much. So exceptions exist, of course, but I think that is absolutely like the speed leveling strat, at least. So if you're not really up for a challenge, if you just want to get to 100, this is also exactly what I was doing during the world first race. I was always aiming for monsters exactly my own level, and I was just outpacing everyone else with that strategy. And now that will absolutely be the case for everyone, I think. So to sum this up, we have these nightmare density changes, and I think they're going to be really cool. It's going to be very exciting to actually see all these monsters there. It's also going to buff Helltide, for example. You're going to get Cinders way faster and all that stuff. So that's actually going to be really nice, and a lot of people have been looking forward to this. But then we also have these boss buffs here, and yeah, it's going to be kind of like a bittersweet feeling, I believe. On one side, they're buffing AoE builds. On the other side, they're buffing single target builds, and I think that was kind of the idea here. But the reality is that a lot of builds just cannot really produce good single target damage, I believe. At least not in the current meta, not with the current means that we have available. We kind of just like need a lot more scaling tools available so that this would make a lot more sense. I think a better move would have been to just up the difficulty of these bosses, as I mentioned, make them stronger, make them faster, so that they're actually a bit of a fight. It can be a short fight, and an intense, short boss fight, I think would be much more cool than just like a punching bag. So that is kind of the change that I was hoping to see here. And well, when it comes down to the meta, I guess we're absolutely gonna have some kind of like no boss versus, you know, anything goes kind of meta, where maybe you have a build that can kind of do it all, that's fine, and then you have builds that just don't want to run any boss dungeons. That will absolutely be a thing, I think, for many players. But let's wait and see how bad it will really be. Generally, I'm quite happy with the patch. I think it's only really this part here where we're gonna be wary about, you know, things shifting, about priorities shifting, about the meta adjusting, and then we'll see how it goes. But this is at least something to expect here. Let me know what you think. Let me know what are your ideas of what Blizzard could do, or maybe how the builds will evolve. And I'll see you guys in the next one.